Okay, colleagues, thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of our colleagues in UNDP Regional Bureau in the Arab States and also the Electoral Assistance Division here in New York, we would like to thank you very much for joining us. We would also like to thank our distinguished panelists. Some of them have already joined, some are still joining. We want to thank them also for kindly making themselves available to share their experiences and very rich knowledge in this area with all of us. If you don't mind, before we start, I wanted to make a couple of actually housekeeping points for your kind information. First, about the interpretation. As you may have kindly noted, so interpretation is available through the options that Zoom provides in a few languages. So please feel free to choose the language that you prefer. Also, the live caption of the Zoom is available for accessibility purposes. So please actually notice that one as well. Of course, the live caption of Zoom may not be 100% accurate. We apologize for that if there will be any technical issues or inaccuracies, but overall, hopefully it will help, and it's a good option. On the chat box, please feel free to post any comments or questions that you may have. You can start even from now if you want to share any experiences or you have any questions, please feel free to do so. When we get to the section on questions and comments, we will for sure review them and we will actually use them. Thanks also for colleagues who have already started using the chat box. So these are the few things which I wanted to mention as the housekeeping. Our colleagues Osame and Razan are also helping with the technical issues. So if you face any problems in having access to the interpretation options or any other questions, technical issues, please post those questions on the chat box and they will be able to kindly help you with that. Okay, with that, maybe a few quick opening remarks, and then we will actually give the floor to our distinguished panelists because they are the ones that have most experiences than me here, and then we want to listen to them more. Last week, there were two major occasions which provided an opportunity for the international community to reflect on the progress made and the challenges that continue to exist with regard to the rights and inclusion of persons with disabilities. We first had the 13th session of the Conference of States Parties to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and then we all observed the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, which was organized this year under the theme of Building Back Better toward the disability inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. I wish here to quote from the UN Secretary General in his address to the conference. The Secretary General in his address to the conference of the states parties to the convention said, and I quote, "Securing the rights of persons with disabilities is necessary for upholding the values and principles of the United Nations Charter. The COVID-19 pandemic has been affecting communities and societies at their very core, deepening pre-existing inequalities. Even under normal circumstances, the 1 billion persons with disabilities worldwide are less likely to enjoy access to education, healthcare, and livelihoods, or to participate and be included in the community in all its dimensions. They are more likely now to live in poverty and experience higher rates of violence, neglect, and abuse due to the pandemic. When crisis grips communities, persons with disabilities are among the worst affected," end of quote. In the same address and on a number of other occasions, the UN Secretary General also underlined the fact that realizing the rights of persons with disabilities is crucial to fulfilling the core promise of the 2030 Agenda, which is to leave no one behind. and that in all our actions, our goal is clear: a world in which all persons can enjoy equal opportunities, participate in decision making, and truly benefit from the economic, social, political, and cultural lives of their societies. This vision will be only achieved through active consultation with persons with disabilities and their respective organizations. The United Nations has made the promotion of rights of persons with disabilities and their inclusion one of its key priorities. This is why last year the Secretary General launched a UN system-wide disability inclusion strategy. The strategy's aim is to bring lasting and transformative change in the organization's work on disability inclusion across its policies, programs, and operations. In May this year, the Secretary General again issued a dedicated policy brief on COVID-19 and persons with disabilities, which highlighted the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on persons with disabilities. Promoting the inclusion of persons with disabilities means first and foremost recognizing and protecting their rights. We must ensure the full participation of persons with disabilities and their organizations in any decision-making processes, which will also at the end have impacts on them. The pandemic is worsening the existing inequalities and producing new threats. The life-altering effects of COVID-19 have been tough on everyone, but indeed tougher on people with disabilities, particularly on persons with intellectual disabilities who need more and more support. The rights of persons with disabilities are protected by a number of UN frameworks. The most extensive recent recognition of these rights is provided in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD, which entered into force in 2008. The convention was further strengthened by an operational protocol which establishes a complaints mechanism. The CRPD aims to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. It embodies a paradigm shift from a charity and medical approach to one which is firmly rooted in human rights. With regard to certain groups of persons with mental health problems and intellectual disabilities, in the past, the so-called established mental incapacity had been used as
كنا نتحدث عن كلمات
a person the right to vote or to hold office. However, the legal landscape has changed profoundly since the convention came into force. CRPD, and particularly Article 29, do not allow any extension for any group of persons with disabilities from the equal and effective enjoyment of political rights, including the right to vote and to be elected. Therefore, it has been argued that any exclusion or restriction of the right to vote on the basis of a perceived or actual intellectual disability would constitute discrimination on the basis of disability within the meaning of Article 2 of the Convention. This argument has been bolstered by recent developments in the jurisprudence of international and regional human rights mechanisms. Concerning the political rights of persons with disabilities, the CRPD is most explicit in Article 29, giving states parties the responsibility to guarantee to persons with disabilities political rights and the opportunity to enjoy them on an equal basis with others. This affirmation of not only the right, but also the opportunity sets up a duty on the states parties to guarantee through the adoption of positive measures that all eligible persons have the actual opportunity to exercise their political rights, including voting rights. Promoting the participation of persons with disabilities in electoral and political processes is a key priority for the United Nations. The Electoral Assistance Division of the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in cooperation with UNDP and other UN entities, developed a policy directive in 2012, which provides key guidance on how best to promote the participation of persons with disabilities in electoral and political processes through UN electoral assistance. This is also a key issue for our needs assessment reports and missions. And many UN electoral support projects in the field today include specific activities and components aimed at promoting the participation of persons with disabilities. The COVID-19 pandemic has further compounded the challenges facing the political participation of persons with disabilities. A lot has been done, a lot of steps have been taken in the past several months since the pandemic started. But a lot of work still remains to be done too. Today, we will have an opportunity to discuss this matter. In our discussions, we intend to address some key questions such as why the inclusion of persons with disabilities is important. What are the challenges and opportunities and how these challenges have been further complicated by the pandemic, and what steps have been taken and good practices have been used to address these challenges so far, and what more needs to be done. We could not possibly have had a better group of experts to address this issue than the panelists that we have today. So in the panel, I hope that they actually, our panelists are already here, but in the panel, we have actually Mr. Facundo Chavez Canillas. Facundo is a human rights and disability advisor from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And we have Miss Virginia Atkinson, Senior Global Advisor for Inclusion at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. We also have Miss Yulia Satchuk, Head of the Ukrainian Organization of People with Disabilities Fight for Right. So let me see if Facundo is here. Maybe we will start with Facundo, otherwise with the other panelists.
He is here, Mansour.
Okay, great. So Facundo, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us. And we are very much looking forward to listening to your kind experiences and excellent knowledge in this area. Facundo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mansour. I'm sorry for coming late to the call. I was struggling with my internet connection. So basically, what I would like to share with you, and thank you again for the invitation and for inviting OHHR to be part of this process. What I wanted to share with you is a little bit what we have seen as the big areas of understanding when it comes to the rights of persons with disabilities in the area of political participation. As you know, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities has a dedicated article to political participation of persons with disabilities. And it's, when we read it, Article 29, we need to read it in conjunction with a number of other parts of the convention. The convention was adopted through a process that involved a lot of persons with disabilities, and we tend to present it as an outcome that is related with the direct participation of persons with disabilities, and a very good example. Some of the very few starting good examples in the UN on how to achieve to a document, particularly a human rights treaty, through the direct involvement of persons with disabilities in those processes. Participation in this treaty is considered across the document, not only in Article 29, but it also comes from Article 4.3, which relates to direct consultation with persons with disabilities. There is an Article 33 that it looks at implementation and monitoring, that includes also a specific reference to the participation of persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. And Article 29 comes to be part of this block of participation monitoring structure within the treaty, to look at how to improve the engagement of persons with disabilities with the political system and with administrative processes that have to do with the development of policies, right? So, and this is coming because of the level of exclusion that persons with disabilities have historically lived, and that led to the development of policies and laws and systems that basically excluded them from being part of a more diverse and a more inclusive society, right? So when we talk about Article 29 and political processes, we're talking about this, one of the pillars, let's say, of participation within the treaty. And when we go into the detail of the electoral processes in particular and political processes that have to do with electoral processes, we look at some very particular situations, right? The first thing that we have to have in mind is that Article 29 of the Convention tackles both the possibility of holding office, which it's a big challenge for persons with disabilities. There are still many constitutions around the world that continue to deny the possibility of persons with disabilities from holding office. The names are very different. There is a very clear category there that is related to persons with psychosocial disabilities or people with mental health conditions that have been openly moved away from the possibility of holding office pretty much in most constitutions in the world. And that had been advancing, and many new constitutions, for example, the Austrian constitution, have eliminated that in the last conventional process to move into a next step in a new generation step. There are many other constitutions that continue to deny this kind of right on many other grounds, and this is told, like, for example, a person is not autonomous to live, and that alone had already excluded a number of people with intellectual disabilities, people with physical impairments, to be part of the political processes and to hold office. So just to present the international framework and to say why participation is important, why persons with disabilities should be at the center, and how they should be involved also in the decision-making from the inside as people that can hold office themselves. The second point, I think, it's much more related to the right to vote and how the right to vote is addressed. The convention is extremely clear in terms of saying that the right to vote should be guaranteed on an equal basis to persons with disabilities, as it is for many other, for everybody else. And the big, I think there are a couple of big points that are related to the right to vote. The first one is that many countries in the world continue to deny the exercise of legal capacity for persons with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, which as a consequence of that denies also the right to vote, as it denies the right to make decisions in many other fora, many other spaces. In particular, the fact that many people are under guardianship basically exclude the whole population from accessing from the right to vote. And unfortunately, it's very difficult to sort out the limitations from political laws or the exercise of the right to vote in political laws. When there is also a provision in the civil codes, most commonly, that establishes guardianship and prevents the exercise of this particular right. Nevertheless, there have been many reforms to electoral processes where this restriction for persons that are under guardianship had been eliminated from the laws. I can give you the example from Peru, from Argentina, where these two countries have eliminated these provisions in their electoral laws without having to go through eliminating guardianship from the civil code, right? So this had been a particular aspect that luckily had evolved on its own with a very clear understanding that there is no need to make or go through the reform, the legal reform in the civil code to guarantee this right. And this is because the way that electoral laws usually establish this is as an exception, right? Instead of putting it as a fundamental structure of the right, what it does is to present it as an exception. As it happens, for example, for people that have been indicted for a crime or for underage. So everybody has the right to vote with the exception of X, Y, and Z person, right? Until very recently, there were other restrictions and many of them still exist. For example, to deaf persons that cannot express in writing, right? And this is still an exception to the right to vote that exists in many legislations around the world. Some constitutions continue to do that, although the number have decreased in the past two decades substantially. Nevertheless, many, as I said before, many of them continue to uphold the exception to the right to vote for people that are under guardianship or that are considered to be persons with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, which is still a big problem in large parts of the world. So as you can see, there is still a lot to do in terms of advocacy to try to change these perspectives and these logics that exist both within constitutional processes as in electoral laws. I think there is a particular aspect that I find particularly important, which is the way of ensuring the participation of persons with disabilities across the system, across the legal system. And that is what happens in conventional processes, right? What happens in constitutional processes and how persons with disabilities are involved in constitutional processes. There are many examples that do, for example, provide for affirmative action for the participation of persons with disabilities in the constitutional processes. And I can cite the experiences in Uganda and Nepal in terms of, for example, in Nepal, there was a reservation of 8 seats for the Constitutional Congress or the Constitutional Assembly, which was discussing in 2013 the constitution in Nepal, right? And what they did was to establish this specific group of seats for underrepresented groups. And among those underrepresented groups were persons with disabilities, right? So these kind of practices, I think, are very interesting to look at, particularly considering that if persons with disabilities are involved in the design of the Constitution, later the discussions that will be associated with the supremacy of law will be much more easier to sort out when there are specific references to persons with disabilities in the Constitution, and the perspectives of persons with disabilities have also been included in the constitutions across the board, right? I would like, we could discuss hours about the rights of persons with disabilities. I would like to just make one final point on Article 29 that is related to the measures that Article 29 provides in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as a way to ensure the right to vote, right? The treaty is very clear. It says you have to guarantee this right. And then it gives, let's say, a very programmatic set of options, which can be read as options, but at the end of the day, if you don't implement these measures, you would be effectively denying the right to vote to many people. And I can give a couple of examples. For example, the convention allows for a person with disability to be supported at the moment of exercising the right to vote, right? And I can give you my own example. I'm a person with disability myself. I'm a wheelchair user and I cannot handle ballots, right? So if I have to enter into the voting room or the voting booth without assistance, I wouldn't be able to manage, the paperwork, to put it in an envelope and to put it in the voting poll. So at the end of the day, I wouldn't be granted the right to vote if I am not also granted with the possibility of coming into the room and to vote with support, right? For people that may not have physical impairments, like blind persons, if they cannot read the ballots, it would be impossible for them to choose in the room on their own, right? So there we have two options. Either you ensure that that person can access to the room with the support, the human support that is necessary, or you make the ballots accessible, right? So you can, for example, using Braille, you can access to the ballots. In that, you have to also have in mind that a large number of persons with disabilities, for example, blind people, are illiterate and are also illiterate in Braille, right? So this is a very important aspect to take into consideration, that not because you are blind, the only solution that you will be provided with is to have Braille ballots on the table, right? At the end, it may happen that because you never had access to education, you may also need a support person to go into the booth and to vote with you. I mean, to pick the ballot with you. So these are just some examples that are also brought by Article 29, and that had been implemented pretty much all over the world. There are some, for example, there are a number of other options, for example, voting by mail, or having accessible electronic voting machines. All of these different options are valid. And in many cases, we need to be very aware that the options that the country may have can be very challenging. And in many cases, it could take them a lot of time to implement these systems for persons with disabilities to exercise this right. But the right to vote, it's a civil right, and it's not subjected to progressive realization. This is not something that we can wait 10 years or 15 years, as it happens with economic and social rights, for their full implementation. They have to happen today, right? Otherwise, the state would be in a violation of international human rights law. So it's very important that we find practical solutions so people with disabilities can vote today, right? That this is not subjected to waiting in the coming years. One final point that I was asked to raise today is what is happening to the right to vote in the context of the pandemic, right? What is happening with persons with disabilities is quite particular. The pandemic, as you know, has different death rates in different countries, but more or less we can say that it may vary between 2 and 5% of the population that gets the virus, right? Now, these percentages for persons with disabilities are extremely higher. And the limitations that people with disabilities face when you get this virus are not the same or cannot be compared to what happens to the rest of the population, right? So we are talking about, we still don't have a strict numbers of what had been the death toll among persons with disabilities, but in developing countries, it's been between 7 and 10%. So it's basically depending on the population, but it could go from 3 to 4 times higher when it comes to persons with disabilities. And many times, this is not because of the underlying health conditions of persons with disabilities, but because of the level of exposure that we have compared to the rest of the population. I cannot clean my hands on my own. I cannot access to, to other goods on my own. And most of us do require human support, right? So there, I mean, in different levels and in different capacities, but most of the time we do require human support. And that is a problem, right, for the purposes of this, for the pandemic. And this had led to a number of exclusions in many systems. And one of them, of course, is the electoral system. So the barriers that are connected to this, in many cases, are connected to attitudinal barriers. We have detected, for example, people attending to vote and people do not want to support them with that fear of, transmitting the infection to the person, to the virus to the person, and putting the person at risk. So this is a reality. And then the other issue is that persons with disabilities are less prone to leave their houses during the pandemic because it's evident that the level of impact on the population is much higher, right? So people with disabilities have self-isolated themselves to prevent being in contact with other people and to expose themselves to the virus. So in this particular situation, it is very difficult that persons with disabilities will be able to exercise the right to vote on an equal basis with others unless we implement solutions, for example, the voting through mail that could be accessible to people with disabilities in the context that we are living on. I think we are coming now at the end of the first stage of this pandemic, but we need to be very sure that not all persons with disabilities will be accessing to the first round of vaccination. Most of the vaccination processes are now looking at other population, and of course they have to look first at health responders, but they are not looking at other essential workers, for example, that will be working in electoral processes in the next year, right? So this will be a particular challenge, right? Because we will have a large population of persons with disabilities that will not be vaccinated, a large population of essential workers that will be working in electoral processes that may not have access to the vaccine, and yet we will still put in people on the situation of having to access to this right and to organize elections in this sense. So I think it would be very important that we look at this issue and we manage to promote emergency measures that can be implemented in these particular cases, right? And I think there is a very fair legal argument to make behind it. Article 11 of the Convention calls for emergency measures in times of situations of risk or humanitarian context. So that alone would provide for the necessary discourse to move into a conversation with governments and to see how this can be implemented, mainly looking at this emergency case. We have seen some countries establishing exceptions to the right to vote, right? Particularly in those countries where the right to vote is where voting is mandatory. So at least to prevent, imposing fines and arbitrary fines, let's say, in this particular case where people are really forced into the situation where they are, so the situation doesn't become even worse. Nevertheless, exempting persons with disabilities from the right to vote, it's never a good solution, right? It's not like you have the opportunity to make these decisions every week, and elections that may happen every 4 years shouldn't be, excluding persons with disabilities because there are no practical solutions in place, right? Some other countries have established, for example, kind of dedicated times of the day. So you can, if you are a person that is at a higher risk during the pandemic, you at least don't have to face, long lines or to be more exposed in this particular context, which is a good practice, definitely. And we can definitely try to look at that. It had happened, for example, in the elections in the US recently, that they dedicated either areas that may not be accessed by a larger group or dedicated timeframes to exercise the right to vote. I think there are a number of other interesting aspects that had happened through the pandemic, which is related to providing, for example, with additional support to persons with disabilities in the voting booths where it had happened, for providing with additional PPEs, general prevention practices that have been going on around for the last 6-7 months, particularly targeting this population. And I think it's, in general terms, the practice has been good. We haven't seen large numbers of increased number of cases connected to elections so far. So that it's a good practice. While of course the more structural restrictions continue to exist, right? Issues that are related to accessing to transport, for example, because of the measures implemented, many of them were not able to be managed, to change for the purposes of the election. Point-to-point services, in many cases, was not possible to implement. But these are aspects that I would say are much more related to structural problems than specific problems that are connected to the pandemic. A final point that I would like to make is connected to access to information. We have seen a large number of countries that after the starting of the pandemic, they moved into implementing concrete measures like sign language in their emergency messages. But unfortunately, and something that we could have believed that it's something, I would say, an issue of the past, that emergency communication should count with sign language interpretation or with closed captioning. This is something that had not happened, and we have seen countries fail and fail again because of that lack of preparation in this sense. But at the same time, we have seen good practices that were connected to that, right? Like immediately after the international community started to raise attention to this issue, many countries started to implement, the provision of sign language and so on to facilitate access to information. And that was also later transferred into electoral campaigns and to other processes that were also connected to that. So I think at this point, we are in a very tricky situation. We are particularly concerned that after the vaccination process starts, people will believe that persons with disabilities are no longer at risk. And this could be really a disaster if that happens. So it's very important that in electoral processes, we keep the attention to this particular population, and we move into continuing the preventive measures in the coming months. I think I will stop there and will give you back the floor. Thank you, Mansoor.
Okay, Facundo, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. Thanks for the very thought-provoking remarks that you kindly shared with us. You kindly mentioned why it's important that we all try our best to promote the participation of persons with disabilities, because I mean, first and foremost, this is an obligation based on the international framework, particularly the convention, but also because of other reasons that you kindly highlighted. You also, thanks for sharing with us examples of the changes which have already been made actually to the constitution and legal frameworks by the member states as a result of the convention, and of course the rest of the commitments based on international frameworks. Thanks for also sharing the ideas on the existing challenges and then how they could be addressed. And also the COVID-19, how that COVID-19 and the pandemic has further complicated the situation, particularly for persons with disabilities, and sharing some of the good examples and good practices that member states have already been actually implementing to address this challenge. Thank you for that. And of course, our distinguished participants will have the opportunity to raise comments or ask questions from you and the rest of our distinguished panelists. Now we will turn the floor to Virginia. As I mentioned before, Virginia is a Senior Global Advisor for Inclusion at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. IFES has done really a lot of work in this area, in the area of inclusion of persons with disabilities, inclusion in general, but also inclusion of persons with disabilities. They have also posted a link to one of the most recent publications from IFES on the chat box, so you will have access to that. And Virginia has played a key role in all these activities undertaken by IFES. Thanks for joining us, Virginia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really appreciative to you, Mansoor, for having this event and talking about the political participation of people with disabilities. I'm going to focus today a little bit on the barriers to political participation that people with disabilities are experiencing during COVID-19. And some of those are existing barriers that have been exacerbated, and some are entirely new because of the pandemic. Then I'll talk a little bit about, there are some good practice examples in countries that have held elections during the pandemic. And I'll end by highlighting a few areas that are not being adequately addressed, where maybe we can all hopefully sort of devote our energies going forwards. So in terms of barriers, Facundo mentioned the legal framework barriers, how a majority of countries have these clauses that are very discriminatory towards people with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities. We also see many election laws or constitutions that say you can't run for office if you don't speak the native language of the country. And the native language doesn't include whatever the native sign language is in that country. But in countries where elections have been held in the pandemic, we're also seeing a lot of discriminatory policies in terms of access to the electoral process. So for example, in some countries, poll workers with disabilities and older poll workers were just automatically dismissed from the poll worker list without even consulting with them. And in talking with election management bodies, they of course thought they were being helpful and thought, oh, older people and people with disabilities won't want to serve as poll workers, so we'll just release them from their commitment. But they didn't consult with those people, and some people actually did want to still serve as a poll worker. So that was a big misstep in terms of the way that the policies were being implemented based on incorrect assumptions about what people with disabilities would be interested in doing. Secondly, an existing barrier that has always been around, and I think is one of the most obvious, is the physical barriers. So polling stations, political party headquarters, parliaments, debate venues, all of them are very often in inaccessible buildings. But what we're seeing now with the pandemic is that countries are reducing the number of polling stations that they have. So voters have to travel farther, which is, I'm sure, inconvenient for everyone, but in particular for voters with disabilities in many countries where public transportation is not accessible. And we're also seeing some countries that did actually have accessible polling stations for people with disabilities, and those are among the first ones that they're closing during the pandemic because they're having staffing shortages. We also are seeing a lack of inaccessible information. So political party manifestos, voter education information on where to go to vote, how to vote, what the COVID safety measures will be, are not usually produced in easy to read for people with intellectual disabilities, sign language, braille, large font. And then with the pandemic, we're seeing the acceleration of information distribution online. And the digital divide really disproportionately impacts people with disabilities. So many don't have access to the internet at home, so they can't engage in webinars like this one. They can't participate in Get Out the Vote initiatives that are on social media or see any political party manifestos that might have been posted on social media. And we're also hearing from many of our disabled person organization partners that many don't have access to laptops or assistive devices that they might have previously had access to when they were going into the office every day with their jobs. So this is also a unique sort of barrier of how COVID has impacted people with disabilities specifically. In terms of once you actually get to the polling station, once you have the information, you're able to get there, we're seeing an increased use of face masks, which is great, necessary for public health, but it compounds the communication barriers that people who are deaf and some people with intellectual disabilities are experiencing, because the face mask is blocking, visual cues. So facial expressions, makes lip reading difficult, you can't tell emotions. But something positive we're seeing there is, for example, in Myanmar, where they had elections just last month, clear face masks were distributed so that you could see the person's lips and you could have sort of a better sense of facial expressions and emotion. Then one of the biggest barriers that sort of permeates all of these other issues is stigma and discrimination. And as I mentioned before, with political life moving more and more online, we're seeing an uptick in hate speech and ableist speech in particular. And so by ableist speech, I mean derogatory terms that are associated with disability that are being used, targeting people with disabilities specifically, or being used even as like an insult to someone who doesn't have a disability. And I think we're all seeing social media companies having a really hard time coming to grips with policing hate speech and ableist speech on platforms. And that in particular happens around elections when there's just sort of an uptick in inactivity online in general. So there's still a lot for us to do to make the political process accessible and inclusive, but we are seeing some good examples. In Bolivia, for example, the election commission there held elections during the pandemic, but they moved their trainings for poll workers online. And they included sign language in the video training online so that people who are deaf could train to be a poll worker. And they also disseminated voter education materials in sign language, in Braille, and in 6 indigenous languages. In Myanmar, they've also held an election during the pandemic just last month. And we worked with, IFAS worked with a self-advocacy organization called Future Stars, where we developed an easy to read guide on how to stay safe while participating in political life during COVID-19. And then we also worked to develop an app, which in the beginning of this year was disseminating information on COVID-19. And then it was repurposed to deliver voter education messages. And one big positive thing that we're seeing in terms of distribution of voter education and accessible materials is that ministries of health have been able to take advantage of the infrastructure that election management bodies have already created to disseminate voter education information. So for example, in Myanmar, civil society organizations were handing out voter education pamphlets alongside hand sanitizers and masks. So there was sort of this 2-for-1 where the Ministry of Health and the Election Commission, which often had not collaborated previously, were able to take advantage of this election-related infrastructure. One of the other good practices that we're seeing is civil society organizations really bonding together and trying to create a sense of community and common purpose in lockdown. I think we're all maybe at the edge here after being in our homes for so long. But in Kyrgyzstan, a group of young people with and without disabilities got together and they organized a series of Instagram live sessions where they could talk together about what's happening in their neighborhood, what is the newest sports team doing, and things where they didn't have to think about the pandemic, but could participate together and still have that sort of sense of community. Similarly, in Tunisia, we've been organizing webinars with the deaf community to discuss how they've been uniquely impacted by the virus, but also by the government's response to the virus, because sometimes these are two different barriers that people with disabilities are experiencing. And so the webinars looked at representation of deaf people in the media, they looked at civic engagement, and also the social and economic impacts that deaf people in particular are experiencing because of the pandemic. And then something else, another good practice we're seeing is, I'm sure we are all familiar, more and more trainings and advocacy is moving online. And while in some cases this is problematic for people with disabilities because of the digital divide, it also gives an opportunity in some cases for people, like last week, there was the Conference of States Parties to the CRPD. And this annual meeting of member states and civil society organizations is usually held in person in New York. And it was supposed to be in June, but was postponed because of the pandemic. And then just last week, they decided to hold it online. And many of our disabled people's organization partners that normally could not have, of course, come to New York in person for previous years of the Conference of States Parties were able to participate online this time. And so that was opening up this space that normally was only reserved for people that could afford to travel and had the means to travel to New York. And so this is one good thing that's really come out of the pandemic in some ways. What IFES has been doing is we have also been moving our trainings online that normally would have happened in person, but we found that like I could have benefited also from a training on how to use Zoom first. So what we've been doing is having trainings on how to use Zoom and then having our trainings on political advocacy. And that has really helped us move forward, while we're all in this current context in terms of keeping people with disabilities engaged in political life. Another thing that we're doing is working with disabled persons organizations on building their capacity to identify the government body in charge of COVID-19 response, and to help them look through the relief packages and see are issues related to people with disabilities in any of these public policy documents. And tangential, related to that, once you've looked through the COVID-19 response policies, you've identified some gaps, how do you then conduct advocacy at home? Many of us, I think, are used to going and knocking on doors to parliamentarians and going to meet in person with the Election Commission to say like, hey, my polling station's inaccessible, or this election law is discriminatory, and we can't do that now. So a lot of what we've also been doing is developing trainings on how to do digital advocacy and still engage while you're safe at home during the pandemic. Then the last thing I wanted to highlight was just a few areas that if we could all really unite together and work together could help eliminate the COVID-specific political participation barriers, as well as existing barriers that will be in place long after the pandemic has passed. And one of those areas is the need for more awareness raising on disability rights with political actors. And so when I say political actors, I mean election management bodies, political parties, observers, members of parliament. And part of the reason that this awareness raising is even needed is because there's not enough people with disabilities serving in all of those roles. So we need to do more education on why people with disabilities should be involved in political life. We need to open up the political process to encourage more people with disabilities to participate, and also more sensitization to existing political actors on why that's important and the value add that comes with that. And tied to that is an issue related to inclusive budgeting. So many election management bodies and parliaments are struggling to secure the additional funding that's needed to respond to the pandemic. And we're seeing with election management bodies, for example, they're taking line items that maybe usually would have been allocated for a tactile ballot guide so that people who are blind can vote on their own and unaided. And they're reallocating that for masks, for example, for poll workers, because budgeting for this wasn't something that anyone had planned for. And because there aren't advocates embedded within these institutions, the inclusion and accessibility features are the first line items that are going. So another thing that we need to work on more is stigma and discrimination. These attitudinal barriers are the root really of all other barriers to political participation. And something that could help with that is a bigger focus on civic education, in particular civic education for young people that are below the voting age. And that can help us focus on preventing these negative stereotypes from developing in the first place. Then we're also seeing a changing funding landscape because of COVID, with donors and international development partners prioritizing health programs, which of course makes sense, but quality health responses are going to depend on a participatory and well-functioning government. So we shouldn't forget the importance of democracy and governance to effective COVID-19 responses. And then the last thing I want to highlight is IFAS is really noticing with our civil society partners the need for more support and training on crisis management, as well as psychosocial support for our partners. Many advocates are working long hours. They might have already been putting their lives at risk, advocating for democracy and inclusion in their country. And now you have this additional stressor related to the pandemic. And this is an area that I'm really not seeing enough focus on, that I think we all could work more together on. And then just to end on a positive note, we really do, as the UN Secretary General said, have the opportunity to build back better here, including on inclusive political participation. So we can include accessibility in all of these relief measures that are going out and budget for accessibility in all of these new packages that are coming out. And also we're seeing in many countries around the world develop alternative voting measures like online voting, postal voting, advanced voting. Imagine if we were to make all of those temporary alternative measures permanent, how helpful that would be for voters with and without disabilities. And I think that's the place I guess I would like to end is just by noting when we make the political process more accessible for people with disabilities, it makes the political process more accessible for everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much, Regina. Thank you so much for sharing with us these very excellent thoughts, suggestions, which is of course based on your own experience of working in this area for a long time. Thanks for that. You kindly mentioned the legal barriers that still people with disabilities are facing, despite the fact that the convention has been in place for many years now, and how actually, hopefully, member states can work together with the support of the international community to address some of those challenges in the legal framework. The discriminatory policies which still exist, and unfortunately, even sometimes we see are developed even despite the existence of the convention. Sometimes making decisions for people with disabilities without even consulting with them, whether that's something that they would also like, or not. So, and then you also kindly highlighted some of the physical barriers that people with disabilities still continue to face. Thanks for also briefly touching upon how actually the social media is being used sometimes for stigma, hate speech, which will negatively impact the persons with disabilities. And also how the pandemic has further complicated the situation for everybody, particularly for persons with disabilities, but also thanks for highlighting a couple of lessons that we may have all learned from this crisis to carry forward, hopefully to improve the situation. And thanks for also making the suggestions about what else could be done in terms, for moving forward to improve the situation, to address some of the existing challenges, awareness raising, especially with political actors, those people who can make a difference, actually inclusive budgeting, addressing its discrimination and stigma. And also thanks for also mentioning how we can build back better using the experiences that we have learned in this crisis. So there are many actually difficult lessons, difficult experiences that we have all had in this crisis. But as you mentioned, maybe there are also good lessons that we hopefully will help us all to do the things better after in the post COVID-19 world. So thank you so much for that, Virginia. I'm sure there will be the opportunity for colleagues, the participants, if they have any comments or questions from you and from the other panelists, to raise it during the questions and answers session. But now we will actually move to the next speaker, who is Yulia. Yulia is the head of the Ukrainian Organization of People with Disabilities, Fight for Right, a self-advocate, human rights defender, and coordinator of the National Disability Advocacy Network. Yulia herself has been in the forefront of fighting for the rights of persons with disabilities. She has done a lot of great work, and this is now a great opportunity for us to listen to Yulia and also to learn from the experiences that she kindly wants to share with us. Yulia, the floor is yours, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the possibility to be here and to share our experience of civil society organization, of movement of people with disabilities, how we deal with local Ukrainian election, which were held in October. As human rights organization of people with disabilities, we advocate for the full implementation of the CRPD in Ukraine. Political rights, according to Article 29, is on our priorities, and we really have an ambitious goal that every person with disability in Ukraine could vote personally, independently, and in secrecy without informational barriers, architectural, and also negative prejudices. Also in our work, we pay special attention at the issue, at the participatory approach and intersectionality. As speaker says, the pandemic was a big challenge before the local election in October this year for all engaging actors in Ukraine. It doubled existing problems regarding access to electoral rights of persons with disabilities. Before election, we as an organization of people with disabilities conducted first in Ukraine a sociological survey on disability, and most of respondents, approximately 75%, says that they would like to vote personally and on voting stations, not at home. But at the same time, from the results of different focus groups and interviews with people with disabilities, which we conducted during the COVID, we understand that the decision, vote or not to vote, will be people with disabilities would make on the basis on different conditions. And also, unfortunately, Ukraine, I think, as different countries in the world, doesn't collect disaggregated data on COVID and people with disability situation. And we don't know the real situation with people with disabilities situation during pandemic. From positive side, our Central Election Commission was playing close attention at holding election in a safe environment. A working group was set up in coordination with Ministry of Health of Ukraine, and this was the first election under the new electoral code of Ukraine. After adoption of this code in 2019, a working group on accessibility and inclusion was established, And we, as an organization of people with disabilities, received a great opportunity to be heard by Central Election Commission, to work closely, to work timely, to make our recommendations, amendments, and it's really influence their results of our common work. Because of COVID, many voters with disabilities need additional security efforts. And as Virginia said, in Ukraine, poor resources were introduced to provide sufficient steps for providing safety. As people with disabilities in Ukraine are one of the most poor group, the absence of masks, gloves, and other protection devices really influenced on their decision go or not to go for the election. So, as we can observe, the large number of voters with disabilities made decision to vote at home or not to vote at all, because voting at home means that group of electoral officers, mainly 3 or 5 persons, will come to your home, and this is also additional risks. State didn't provide alternative, more secure ways for voting remotely for voters with disabilities. Also, many people with disabilities said that they decided not to vote because they need another person who help them to go to voting station, to mark the ballot, to be in one voting booth, and but they afraid because this is also additional risks for their health and for health of their families. From our side, as an organization of people with disabilities, we work closely with Central Election Commission, as I mentioned, and IFOC Ukraine, and we started the big project in the framework of our accessibility and inclusion working group, Time Up for Accessible Elections. And I'd like to share our most, the biggest results and positive things. I think it would be useful for many people around the world. We decided to make a broad national information campaign on the importance of voting for voters with disabilities, who make up about 7% of the total number of voters in Ukraine. As the main source of information on political life and electoral processes for people with disabilities, especially during a pandemic, was internet, which contains its threats to both inaccessibility and opportunities for manipulation and misinformation. We firstly developed a website for voters with disabilities with clear, understandable information on electoral process, including COVID issues. Also, during a month before election, we provided legal assistance for voters with disabilities, for different people, by our Telegram chatbot, and our lawyers answering 24/7 for any questions people have regarding electoral rights of voters with disabilities. When used, access to internet is often limited for people in rural areas, for people who are in close institution, and elderly people. So we decided to add radio as more available source of information for these people. And we launch radio tracks with clear explanation for voters with disabilities, how to vote during COVID, and about safety measures. And also we try to do the best to make this information really simple and understandable for people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, as a more excluded group in political processes. Also, I'd like to share if we have such opportunity and to we could all to see one of the best our products in the framework of our project. One of the 4 videos about voting for people with disabilities, in which we described motivation to vote, in which we share information about importance of exercising political and electoral rights by people with disabilities, and we describe possibilities how to do this safely, and we clearly explained how to vote during pandemic, and also this video contains step-by-step instruction for voters with disabilities. And if we have such possibilities, I'd like to ask to turn on this video.
Thank you. Sure, we will do it. Thank you, Yulia. Yeah, we will watch the video now.
Can you see the video now?
We don't see it. Oh yeah, now we can. But
Okay,
we can
perfect.
you can just play it back.
Я Григорій, і моє життя – це танці. Хореографія, можна сказати, це ремесло. Ти ловиш ритм і підбираєш рухи, а пізніше усе це складається в одну картину. Секрет вдалого танцю – це коли тобі вдається повністю розкрити своє «я» через рухи і музику. У мене з дитинства відсутній слух, проте я можу відчувати музику тілом і навчати цього інших. В Україні майже 3 мільйони людей з інвалідністю, і щодня ми робимо більше, ніж інші від нас очікують. Голосувати важливо для кожного і кожної з нас. 25 жовтня я піду на вибори, щоб мій голос почули.
Ковід ув'язнив тебе вдома, але не дай йому шанс забрати твій голос. Перед походом на дільницю одягни одноразові рукавички та маску. Візьми з собою ручку. Не забувай про антисептик на виборчій дільниці та тримай дистанцію 1,5 метри. Досі вагаєшся, чи твій голос важливий? 2 мільйона 700 тисяч людей в Україні мають ту чи іншу форму інвалідності. Якщо ти не проголосуєш, втратиться 7% усіх голосів. Виборці, які мають порушення слуху, мають право спілкуватися із членами виборчої дільниці у зручний спосіб, використовувати телефон або інший засіб для спілкування жестовою мовою на дільниці, вимагати інформацію про вибори у доступних форматах.
Давай голосувати.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yulia, please.
Yes, and we screened this video on national TV channels, social media, online news resources, and so we achieved more than 2 million coverage, and we made such video for each type of disability: physical, visual impairments, hard of hearing, and also psychosocial and intellectual disabilities. And I think it's a really great way to engage people with disabilities, but provide them information how to do this safely, how to vote without risks, and so to be really engaged in the processes. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much, Yulia, for the very valuable thoughts and experiences that you so kindly shared with us. It was really a great opportunity for all of us, and I'm sure the rest of the participants would kindly agree with me that it was so important to hear from you as somebody who has worked in this area in the forefront of fighting for the rights of persons with disabilities, and to listen to your experiences firsthand what were the challenges that you were facing, what were the measures that you and your team undertook to address those challenges, what worked, what did not work. Also, you kind of highlighted at the very beginning the very important point about the participatory approach and the intersectionality approach that has worked, and also the obstacles that still are there, those which were addressed, but those that still exist, how the measures you undertook help the people to be encouraged to turn out to vote and to try to be included, and also how to encourage others to ensure that they will take the measures that would lead hopefully to the inclusion of persons with disabilities. And also thank you so much for sharing this very nice video. We will also post the link to that video on the chat box for colleagues also if you want to have it and to watch it again. Thanks for that. Now we will open the floor for questions and comments from the participants. Usually, because we have a large turnout, usually we actually only focus on questions and comments which come up in the chat box. I think we have about maybe 10-15 minutes for questions and answers, not unfortunately more than that. So I will first raise a couple of questions and comments which came through the chat box, and then if anybody wants also to directly raise any questions to any of our panelists, we will be very happy to give the floor to those colleagues who are interested too. So one of the questions which has come up actually in the chat box is that, I mean, colleagues have mentioned that in certain countries, in certain member states, still, political actors, possibly the governments, are not proactively encouraging people with disabilities to register and to vote. So what are your advice for the civil society organizations, for other actors in these contexts? So the reference here has been made to the Arab region, but honestly, I think this is a challenge that we will face in many other regions as well. So the question is, while in many countries, despite the existence of the convention and all the legal requirements, still the political actors do not proactively encourage people with disabilities to register and vote. Well, I mean, in those contexts, what we can do to promote this participation. And maybe if you don't mind, maybe Facundo, you would kindly wish to start by, any reflection on that question. Then, of course, other distinguished panelists also, we will ask them to kindly help with that.
Yes, what we have seen that, disenfranchising people from voting is something that not only happens for persons with disabilities, right? There are many other processes that are based on race and many other reasons why people are discouraged to participate in electoral processes. Definitely for persons with disabilities may not be the same kind of intentionality behind it, but definitely it's something that we continue to see within legal structures particularly. The issue of accessing to ID cards, for example, it's something that had been widespread as a problem for persons with disabilities, to the point that that registration is it's a dedicated right in the convention, right? So I think this is something that it's much more structural, I would say, than conjunctural, let's say, right? It's not connected to something that is happening in a given time. So some experiences that are related to this. First of all, is to have a very clear guidance in terms of awareness raising towards increasing participation of persons with disabilities themselves. And one of the challenges around that, it is definitely connected to the fact that people with disabilities are not aware of their rights, are not aware of what are the possibilities that they have to access that particular right. And pretty much systemically, they have been told that they are not going to be part of those processes anyway, right? The experiences of accessing to voting to voting booths that are inaccessible, to get there, it's so difficult and it's so hard to actually exercise the right. It's also discouraging for persons with disabilities to engage on that. And in some countries, unfortunately, there is basically a systemic way of disenfranchising persons with disabilities, particularly people under guardianship, which is by crossing the ID number with certification mechanisms like disability cards and so on, where people had been eliminated from registries on purpose, right? So this is something that is very important to have in mind, because at the end of the day, with the way that you are, the message as a person that you receive is that you are not welcome, right, to be part of that. So it tends to be easier to get yourself go and let the system to manage things the way it does than to really create a conscious among persons with disabilities of how to exercise this right and how to move forward. So what I would say as a first cornerstone of this is to be very sure that awareness raising campaigns, for example, particularly targeting persons with disabilities, are informing them about their rights and what they can do, regardless of the fact that they are, for example, disenfranchised by the system itself.
Thank you so much, Facundo. Virginia, you would like to add anything on that, or?
Sure. I mean, to me, I think the biggest thing that we need to do in order to encourage more political actors to include people with disabilities is we need to infiltrate those systems. You know, people with disabilities need to be members of political parties, need to run for office, need to serve, you know, in the election management body. And by infiltrating those spaces, then our voices can be heard there. And so similarly to that, election management bodies, parliaments, et cetera, are not consulting with disabled persons organizations. And so that's something that we can try and do a better job of too, is raising awareness of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, of Article 29, and have people with disabilities in these spaces. Over 90% of UN member states have ratified the treaty, but usually it's the Ministry of Health or Ministry of Social Welfare that's responsible for its implementation. So Article 29, focused on political participation, is not in the purview of those ministries. It's something that the political actors need to be more aware of. So I think the more we can kind of infiltrate those political spaces and help connect those dots, the better chance we'll have of more inclusive political life.
Thank you so much. Yulia, you would also kindly like to add anything on that?
Yes, so
Sure.
as a disability rights advocate and activist, I could add that I think very effective is to show the real systematic work by the states, authority bodies, and civil society organizations and people with disabilities. For example, in Ukraine, the establishment of a working group by Central Election Commission, IFES Ukraine, and different NGOs and activists, it was a really great step forward, disability inclusion to the agenda for next for next years. And for people with disabilities, it is really important to see maybe little but really big steps. For example, our Central Election Commission this year, they modified their website and try to make it more accessible for people with different types of disabilities, and it's really work. And in their informational campaign, they use also sign languages. They often asked us as civil society activists how to do things better. And when people with disabilities see this, they really also understand that state take this issue seriously, and it's really depends on their interest on political participation. And also one of the thing is empowering of people with disabilities themselves. For example, last year, together with IFAS Ukraine, we also conducted school for political participation for young women and girls with disabilities. And this year we received a great result, one of the greatest result. We received a new elected during this local election member of one of our region councils. This is blind girl, blind woman from she is participant of our school, and now she share her experience how to be active in political sphere, her way to this position, and how to run for office, and how to communicate correctly. And you know, this is really the first blind woman in Ukraine who became a deputy, and it's really great to see this role model for more people with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yulia. Unfortunately, we don't have that much time left. Actually, we have already passed a couple of minutes, but out of respect for our participants who have been so kindly contributing to the discussions through the chat box, if you don't mind, maybe we will raise a couple of more questions which have come up in the chat box. But we will try our best to be as brief as possible responding to them. One of the key questions, or maybe comments, which has come up in the chat box is that also, which goes back to the point that you kindly mentioned, Virginia, about the role that different ministries, different governments, entities can really undertake in supporting the inclusion of persons with disabilities. Not only about the electoral management body, it's about different ministries. So one point which has come up is about the role of the ministries of education, how they actually can play a role in this regard to ensure that, the legal requirements, the different aspects of the need for inclusion of persons with disabilities, of their rights, promoting their rights, are included in the educational curriculum from the very beginning, so that people would know when they are actually, even very, very young. Any comments on that? Maybe we will start with Virginia this time, if you don't mind.
Sure. Just briefly, I can say these partnerships with the ministries of education and election management bodies are really important. Many polling stations in most countries around the world are in schools. So, if we're making schools accessible, then that's helpful for teachers and students with disabilities, also helpful for voters and poll workers, observers, et cetera, with disabilities. So that's one area where, elections and the Ministry of Education can overlap. Then the other would be on civic education, as you mentioned, Mansour, that, most civic education curriculums don't, for example, include reference to the UN Disability Treaty. And they don't include reference to, the national disability rights movements in each country. And that's something, that if we could help mitigate from the beginning and eliminate these negative stereotypes in young people, we could perhaps have a more inclusive society going forward.
Thank you so much. Yulia, you want to also reflect on that, based on your experiences, the role that ministries of education, different, ministries can play in this regard?
Yes, I totally agree with Virginia, and only just from Ukrainian experience, I think Ministry of Education could be very effective in the providing information or electoral information in accessible formats. For example, in Ukraine, we don't have standards of accessible information, and I think that Ministry of Education should be one of the leading actors in these processes.
Thank you so much. And Facundo, anything? Okay, so.
No.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Also, we would like to thank colleagues who have posted actually experiences from different countries. From Nepal, we have actually comments there, what has been done, what is the situation. There is also the comment from Iraq, what is the situation there? I mean, the fact that the challenges that persons with disabilities are facing. Unfortunately, we may not have that much time left. I just wanted to give the floor if our panelists wants to make any final comments before we conclude. Starting maybe with Yulia. Any final comments?
Maybe I think that from the side of people with disabilities, as a representative of this community, I'd like to add only that issue of political and electoral participation, it's really important to have this possibility to be impactful and to influence on state policy and to take part on decision-making processes. It's really important for people with disabilities. So let's together fight for the equal participation during election and in political rights at all.
Thank you so much. Virginia, would you like to add as the final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I just think for those of us working in the political space broadly, my one recommendation would just be consult with DPOs. Short and sweet, consult with DPOs.
Thank you, thank you. Fakunde, any final comments on your part?
Thank you, Mansour. Yes, I think the key aspects here are really to look at how we can advocate for changing those frameworks that are still excluding persons with disabilities. Second, the importance of supporting governments on finding creative solutions that do allow for exercising the right to vote today, and not within the next 15 or 20 years when everything is accessible. And the third point is really to look at this issue of supporting persons with disabilities in the electoral processes. I think what Virginia said, I think it's extremely important. We need to infiltrate these systems with persons with disabilities themselves, to be part of these processes, to guide governments, and also to bring their experiences, which are extremely valuable for this process, right? And thank you again.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks. I think it was very thought-provoking discussions and remarks by our three panelists, and also the comments that colleagues and participants kindly shared. We are really sorry that we don't have more time to actually discuss this very, very important issue in our webinar today any further, but for sure we will be thinking about possibly organizing other follow-ups and hopefully to have more time to discuss that. Thank you so much. We discussed the fact that, of course, there is the convention, there are the legal frameworks, international legal framework in place. I mean, based on the convention to which the overwhelming majority of the member states have joined, there is no ground now really for any discrimination. There is no ground that member states would say, or any specific government would say that, you know, or would not take proactive action and would say that, I mean, this is not something as a priority. It's a priority for everybody. This is an international requirement, international commitment for almost all member states. So this is the reality. As you all kind of mentioned, nothing can be done for persons with disabilities without their involvement, without consulting with them, without engaging persons with disabilities and their organizations so that they would be guiding the discussions. Awareness raising is extremely important. Working together collectively with different sectors of the society, political actors, civil society, traditional leaders, community leaders, those are really, really make a big difference. They can be really good partners in helping us all to make further progress in this area. The pandemic has made the life difficult for everybody, but it has made it even more difficult for vulnerable communities in our societies, particularly for persons with disabilities. So we should take this into consideration when we are actually planning our work, especially in the area of electoral assistance and supporting electoral processes. And hopefully we will take some lessons from this pandemic, which we will carry forward with us for further improvement in the future. There are lessons that we have learned that can be helpful not only now in the pandemic, but also in the future. So thank you so much for that. What we will do is that the comments which were raised also in the chat box. For sure, they will not be missed. I promise you. With UNDP colleagues, we are going to come up with a summary of the discussions in all the webinars, including our webinar on this key issue today. And all of you will be receiving a summary of the discussions of all the webinars. I'm not promising that you will be getting it today or tomorrow, but one day you will get it, hopefully. Hopefully not in a distant future. But thank you so much. Our sincere thanks to all our participants. Our heartfelt thanks to our panelists who were so kindly and generously available to share their thoughts with us, and for all of you to join us. Our sincere thanks to our UNDP colleagues with whom we have been partnering on these and other initiatives, and thanks to all of them. And also our sincere thanks to our interpreters who patiently actually followed the discussions, helped us with that. Wish you all the best and stay safe. And thank you so much again.